Good evening, Central. Pastor Ben here again, sharing tonight's devotional. We're here again in our Advent season of just preparing for Jesus' coming and his return in this Advent season. So, knowing that we're anticipating that and desiring that so much, I know I've been gravitating a lot to just Jesus' time on earth as well as his teaching. So, tonight's devotion comes out of Jesus' kind of teaching on the greatest commandment. So, from Matthew 22. 34 through 40, it says this: But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to them, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it: You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So Jewish leaders in Jesus' day often fought over the relative importance of commandments. Some held that the view of observing the Sabbath was the most important. Others viewed circumcision over all else. And we saw that in that time, Pharisees had so many rules and regulations and commands, over 600, I believe. And all of those, they would kind of debate which ones were the most important. So here they were trying to trip up Jesus, right? Which one would be the most important of all of those? And it's interesting because what would that be like today? And I think we see it a lot as we debate which is the most important issue that we need to be voting on and which is the most important issue that we need to be thinking of as the church. And we have all of our passionate things that we're about. And unfortunately, what happens in the church is we start thinking of others as thinking that they don't think that other ones are as important, because you must not love God if you don't think that this is important. And you don't follow those things, and you don't follow those ideas of this is one of the greatest commandments, don't you think? And those ideas start losing, especially when we forget what Jesus is teaching here. He's teaching it's all about God. And the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. And everything we are needs to be loving God. And knowing that portion of everything we are and giving it to God. And there's a second command that's tied to that can't be taken away from it, that Jesus is talking to and trying to give everyone and just bring this all back together, and saying the second commandment is just tied to it and saying you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And thinking the ways that God loves us so much, our response is to love God and then to love others, just like we are to love ourselves. And again, that calling to love ourselves, there could be this corruption, right? Because there's a self-love that is corrupt. We're selfish beings, and we're selfish and broken by nature because of our sinful natures. But that root of the greatest sin would be coming here in our hearts, right? But the idea of that selfishness needs to be pushed away at times when we're thinking about self-love, because when we're thinking about self-love, in knowing that God has loved us, we need to sink in that love that God has given us and absorb and know that we need to take care of the vessel that God's given us so that we can love others. And too often now, especially in these times, we need to take care of ourselves. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. It's not love your neighbor more than yourself and love your neighbor neglecting yourself. It's love your neighbor as yourself, right? The God would pretty much say it's a given that you're going to take care of yourself, right? So we need to be taking care of ourselves because God loves us so much. We're image bearers of Him. So why aren't we taking care of these temples that He's given us? So that's extremely important to be knowing that God's given us the ability to make sure that we're eating right, sleeping well, taking care of our mental capacities, our spiritual capacities, our emotions, everything in these times that are going haywire. We need to make sure that we are finding the right times to be able to balance those well and find the right help at times and go to the right places and seek help when we need those helps. And I know for myself, I've done that. I know when I've needed help with kind of just making sure I can accountability for exercising. I've had good brothers in Christ really push me and challenge me. I've had good support from my wife and family on just eating healthy and eating right, especially in these COVID times. I've had ability for accountability from close people that I lean on to making sure that I'm acting properly. And so just all those prayer partners and aspects that just have really kept me accountable in my spiritual walks, my spiritual walk, and just all of that again is the self love that God again loves me, and I know God's love, that I'm able then to love my neighbor as myself. And why that's so important too is because I've been reflecting so much on Revelation 7:9 and the idea that when we're up in heaven, we'll see again all nations, all tongues, all tribes. And that's a perfect picture of what we want to see here on earth. This imperfect picture here on earth is perfectly shown in heaven in Revelation 7:9. But we want to strive for it here. So as we're loving others that aren't part of that kingdom yet, how are we loving those that are not like ourselves? And I was listening to a podcast, and there's a saying that really stuck to me, and it said, proximity breeds care, distance breeds fear. And he was talking a lot about how a lot of times we build these barriers and walls that we're not engaging with people that are different than ourselves. So proximity, when we draw ourselves near to those that aren't like us, breeds care. So again, it's not just physical kind of proximity, but just again, empathy or learning or understanding. And when you get that proximity of closeness to someone or learning about somebody or wanting to be near someone or a discussion with people, proximity breeds care, but distance breeds fear, right? The inability to know, the ability to kind of just guess and say say that I know what that person's thinking breeds fear. So the more we engage in that relationship and desire for relationships, we're calling it befriend one and bring into that notion that we want to build those relationships. We want to love our neighbor as ourselves. So will you join us as we are seeing that? God is doing that all over, and it's encouraging. I've been seeing God do work in our community, and it's been a blessing. So will we continue to strive for this? Strive for the ways that we want to love God and see that love for us. Where do I see in my life I perceive God's love for me? And then that love that he has for me, can I see this week, can I tangibly see God's love for me that I can pass it on to someone else? God bless you, and may we be God's light for others.